Hello, it's Psychocore, the paradox of excessive effort, why overstriving leads to failure. Pay close attention to what I'm about to share with you. This isn't merely a dramatic statement or a cheap trick to capture your interest. What you're about to discover could fundamentally shift how you perceive yourself in just a few moments. Are you prepared to continue? Once you embark on this journey, you won't be able to unsee what I'm about to reveal. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you'll recall these words. You'll experience that uncomfortable sensation in your chest, like an invisible hand gripping exactly where you believed you were secure. I must warn you, once you grasp this concept, there's no returning to ignorance. Let me pose a question that appears straightforward but contains a toxin that corrupts every choice you make. Why do you persist in believing that increased effort brings you closer to fulfillment? Who persuaded you that exhausting yourself until you're depleted was a mark of worthiness? I want you to recall the precise moment when you began measuring your value by the amount of suffering you could tolerate. That moment exists. Perhaps it occurred during childhood when someone made you feel undeserving unless you gave everything. Maybe it happened later when you realized the world venerates martyrs while despising those who understand limits. Today, I'm going to shatter that illusion. I'm going to tell you something your mind has been refusing for years because it's too harsh to accept without resistance. Your fixation on giving everything isn't a demonstration of strength. It's the clearest indication of your deepest insecurity. The one that whispers that if you relax for even a moment, everything you've constructed will crumble like a house of cards. The worst part isn't that you think this way. The worst part is that you believe it so intensely that your entire body responds as if it were reality. Do you understand why you drive yourself relentlessly even when it no longer serves you? Because you mistake dedication for bondage. Your mind has learned to equate extreme exhaustion with safety, as if accumulating fatigue were undeniable proof that you deserve recognition. But I want you to envision something different. Imagine that all the sacrifice you wear like a medal is nothing more than a disguise, a mask you don to prevent others from suspecting what's truly happening inside. That you don't trust yourself, that you fear if you ever choose to rest, the world will point at you and declare what terrifies you most, that you're not as capable as you appear. Do you feel that chill? It's your subconscious stirring because it recognizes the truth in my words, the truth that nobody dares confess to you, the truth that sounds like blasphemy in this culture that worships sacrifice. But I want you to keep listening, even if your instincts urge you to close this video. Because if you flee now, you'll confirm that you prefer living trapped in the prison you've built for yourself. A prison whose walls are constructed from excessive effort and fear disguised as virtue. I'm going to ask you something. Pause your thoughts for a moment and examine yourself. Do you remember the last time something began going wrong and instead of stopping to analyze, you pressed harder on the accelerator? As if forcing more would correct the course. The harder you pushed, the faster everything around you shattered. That's the paradox nobody explained to you. When your mind panics, your instinct is to force more when what you need most is to release. Don't look away yet, because what you're experiencing right now, that sharp pain climbing your throat, that pressure in your chest, signals that we're reaching the core of your fear. What would happen if you discovered that all your sacrifice hasn't brought you closer to the life you desire, but has actually pushed you further away? Can you imagine awakening to realize that while you were striving to be flawless, to be sufficient, to be tireless, your authentic self was withering in a corner you didn't dare examine? Today, we're going to enter that corner. I warn you, there are no motivational slogans there, no promises of instant success. The only thing you'll find is a mirror. In that mirror, you'll see the reflection of someone who has been convinced for too long that the only path is to wear yourself down until breathless. But before you look away, I want you to do something. I want you to breathe and acknowledge that this excessive effort is actually the most dangerous strategy of all. Because while you believe you're advancing, you're only prolonging the fear that controls you. So if you've decided to stay, prepare yourself, because today we're going to uproot the most toxic illusion you were taught. The one that tells you that the more you suffer, the more valuable you become. When we're finished, you won't view your effort the same way again, because you'll understand that sometimes the harder you try not to lose, the faster you destroy everything. I'm going to tell you something that probably nobody has had the courage to say to your face. There's a vast difference between throwing yourself passionately into what you love and living in a perpetual state of tension that bleeds you from within. That boundary is so thin that most cross it without noticing, convinced they're doing the right thing. But I want you to stop and reflect on an image your mind will try to reject because it's uncomfortable. Imagine that all the energy you expend isn't building anything solid but feeding a fire that will eventually consume you. It won't be a noble fire, it will be a dirty one fueled by the anxiety of feeling insufficient. Consider this with brutal honesty. How many times has your excessive effort transformed you into a rigid, inflexible version of yourself? Because when everything depends on being perfect, you lose the ability to adapt. And adaptation is the only skill that allows you to grow without self-destruction. Do you realize that rigidity isn't strength? Rigidity is the prelude to fracture. The hardest wood isn't the one that resists the storm, it's the one that breaks. Let me take you to a corner of your mind you avoid examining. That space where you know that although you claim you act from commitment, you actually act from terror. Terror of being replaced, terror of being invisible, terror that someday people will discover you're not as exceptional as you believed. That's why you run. That's why you don't rest. Because deep down, you're convinced that if you lower your guard even momentarily, everything will collapse. But I want you to consider this. What if your worth didn't depend on your capacity to exhaust yourself? What if all that heroic theater wasn't necessary to deserve respect? Now let me dismantle another myth they've sold you as sacred doctrine. The idea that you must always be available, always ready, always proving you care more than anyone else. Do you know what happens when you don't give yourself permission to pause? Your mind becomes a minefield. Every small setback becomes a catastrophe. Every doubt from others feels like unbearable humiliation because your resilience doesn't come from calmness, but from a nervous system on fire. Here's where something almost nobody mentions comes into play. The trap of chronic self-demand doesn't only ruin your projects, it also contaminates your relationships. People sense your obsession. They smell it in the air like dampness in an old house. You can't disguise it with smiles or well-rehearsed phrases. When your self-esteem depends on proving you're indispensable, everything you do is soaked in that unhealthy urgency. Every kind gesture becomes a transaction. Every favor you grant is an investment you expect to cash in for validation. Validation that is begged for doesn't nourish, it only poisons. Want an example to shake you? Think about the last time you offered help enthusiastically and then felt anger when they didn't thank you as expected. Does it seem like a minor detail? It isn't. It's proof that your giving was contaminated by the expectation of recognition. That's the price of effort born from fear. It always leaves you empty, always comes with a cost. I want you to understand something that may sound counterintuitive. People aren't attracted to those willing to sacrifice themselves. They're attracted to those who can say no without guilt, those who help because they want to, not because they need the favor returned. To reach that state of clarity, you first have to uproot the belief that your constant sacrifice is virtuous. Because it isn't. It's a chain. Maybe now you're thinking that if you don't give everything, you'll stagnate. That if you're not first to arrive and last to leave, nobody will take you seriously. But let me ask you something few have the courage to question. Are you really progressing with that strategy? Or are you just trapped in a cycle of exhaustion that you mistake for progress? Because tiredness isn't an indicator of success. It's just an indicator of tiredness, and most of the time it's a sign that you're running from something you don't want to face. I'm going to take you further. I want you to imagine that your disproportionate effort is a monster you've been feeding for years. Every time you accepted a commitment you didn't want. Every time you forced yourself to smile when you were broken. Every time you silenced your discomfort for fear of seeming unprofessional. You fed it. That monster has grown so large that now it seems impossible to kill. But the truth is, you can starve it to death. How? By starting to act from a different place, from a space where your worth doesn't depend on your capacity to sacrifice yourself. Do you know what happens when you start letting go? When you decide your peace of mind is worth more than your reputation as a tireless hero, something inside you shifts. Your gaze clears. Your voice regains firmness. Ironically, people begin to respect you more because the serenity you radiate reminds them of something they also long for. The freedom of not having to prove anything. If you dare to try it, you'll feel a mix of vertigo and relief. For the first time in your life, you won't be acting to please someone else's ideal. You'll be choosing for yourself. That choice has a price. You'll disappoint those who were accustomed to your sacrifice, those who benefited from your fear. But I want you to know something. If you have to destroy yourself to be loved, that's not love. If you have to give up your rest to be respected, that's not admiration, it's dependency. Dependency always ends up devouring your dignity, so look at me carefully as I say this. You are not more valuable for how much you endure. You are not more worthy because you never complain. You are not more respectable because you work until your eyes bleed. That is not courage, it's psychological slavery. The world doesn't need more slaves, it needs people who dare to look in the mirror and say, "Today I will not sacrifice my health to feed the myth that I am unbreakable." If you've made it this far, I invite you to do something few dare to do. The next time you feel the urgency to prove you can handle everything, give yourself a moment of silence. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? What part of me is so afraid to stop? If you have the courage to listen to the answer, you'll have taken a step that most never dare to take. A step toward the freedom to exist without the obligation to sacrifice yourself for applause that never lasts more than a day. Now that we've reached this point where your mind begins to notice something doesn't align with the heroic narrative you were always told, I'm going to take you deeper to a place almost nobody dares to look. The void that appears when you decide to stop pushing so hard. Because that's where the real test arises. Not when you're running to cover your insecurities with hours of sacrifice, but when you stay still and all the noise disappears. Do you know what happens in that silence? You begin to hear the voice you've always been trying to silence, the one that whispers you don't know who you are without the fatigue that justifies you. Think about it. For as long as you can remember, you've been filling every minute with obligations, with tasks that make you feel productive, with acts of goodwill that your brain catalogs as signals that you are valid. When you stop for a moment, when you dare not to answer a message immediately or not take on another absurd commitment, your mind panics. Why? Because chronic effort becomes an identity that, although it destroys you, is familiar. The human brain prefers familiar misery over unknown freedom. Do you realize the trap? Constant exhaustion isn't only a consequence of your fear of failure. It's also your alibi. A sophisticated excuse not to face what really terrifies you. That maybe your worth doesn't depend on anything you can prove. that maybe your worth is so obvious you don't need to sacrifice yourself daily to validate it. But admitting that would be an earthquake in the structure you've built. Because if you don't need to push yourself to the limit, what was the point of all the suffering you've inflicted on yourself? The answer is brutal but necessary. It made no sense beyond teaching you how far you can endure, beyond turning you into a tragic example of how easy it is to confuse self-demand with dignity. Now, take a deep breath because we're going to keep descending into this labyrinth. I want you to observe a phenomenon that happens almost secretly. When you live in constant sacrifice mode, your perception distorts. Everything starts to take on the same color of urgency. Small annoyances become threats. Uncertainty becomes a monster. The smallest doubt feels like an attack on your identity. Little by little, you lose the ability to distinguish the important from the trivial. That's one of the greatest costs of your obsessive effort. It robs you of perspective. It turns you into an animal trapped in its own burrow, convinced that any mistake is the end. The irony is that this tunnel vision doesn't make you more efficient. It makes you clumsier, more vulnerable. Because when everything matters too much, you can't prioritize. When everything is an emergency, everything burns you. I'm going to share something you probably never put into words but feel in your bones. Behind every sleepless night, every sacrificed weekend, there's a yearning you don't dare admit. The yearning to be seen. The yearning for someone someday to look you in the eyes and say, "You can stop now. You've done enough." But that recognition never comes because the world has neither time nor interest to give you that comfort. If you expect your environment to applaud you for destroying yourself, prepare for monumental disappointment. Here comes another uncomfortable truth. While you believe your extreme effort is admired, many people simply interpret it as a sign that you don't know how to set boundaries, that your fear of losing is so great that you'd rather lose yourself than miss an opportunity. Do you know how that desperation smells from the outside? Like weakness. That's why, paradoxically, the more you show that everything matters to you, the less respect you generate. People respect those who have the ability to walk away when something no longer deserves their energy. Because that ability doesn't come from disinterest. It comes from internal clarity. Let me ask you something that might disturb you more than everything before. What would happen if tomorrow nobody were watching? If all those people you try to impress suddenly disappeared? If there were no audience for your effort? Would you keep sacrificing yourself the same way? Or would you finally allow yourself to rest without guilt? The answer to that question is a map that shows you how much your identity depends on external applause. I want you to understand this with every cell in your body. Pushing yourself beyond limits doesn't just drain your energy. It drains your clarity, your ability to enjoy, your ability to connect with others honestly. Because when your mind is on high alert, there's no room for pleasure, no place for curiosity. Lightness doesn't exist. Everything becomes a transaction. When you turn your entire life into a battlefield, the most dangerous enemy always ends up being your own reflection. So today I invite you to an act of rebellion that may seem insignificant but contains more power than any heroic sacrifice. I invite you to do nothing, to allow yourself a moment of stillness, to try how it feels when you stop moving to impress others, to discover what part of you survives when all that urgency disappears. I warn you, what you find may not be pleasant at first because silence reveals everything you've spent years covering up with your obsession to be flawless. But it's also the only place where you can begin to rebuild yourself without the tyranny of anxiety. If you're still here, it's because something inside you senses that it's time to abandon that old strategy that keeps you always exhausted. Although part of you wants to resist, another part begins to understand that sometimes true courage isn't about doing more but doing less, recognizing that you have nothing to prove. Because the only thing truly worth your effort is the peace you've been postponing while trying to be perfect. Now that we've reached this point where you can no longer pretend you don't know, now that your mind is breathing that mixture of relief and vertigo that only comes when you touch the root of your own prison, I want you to do something very few dare to try. Look at the place where your extreme effort has brought you. Look at it without romanticism, without excuses, without adornments. Is this the place you dreamed of? Is this the life you imagined when you started fighting to be someone? If your answer is an uncomfortable silence, congratulations. You have just discovered that all your discipline, all your sacrifice, all your fear disguised as virtue has only led you to an exhaustion that isn't worth it. But don't worry, I haven't come to give you a hopeless diagnosis. Because right when you recognize that your way of living is based on a mistake, the greatest possibility opens up before you. The possibility to reinvent yourself, to abandon the superstition that constant effort is the only way to deserve love, success, or respect, to discover firsthand what happens when you start choosing calmly instead of reacting with anxiety. Many people who listen to this wait for the perfect recipe. They want me to tell them the exact moment they should stop, how many hours are legitimate to dedicate, what amount of effort is just right. But that question reveals they're still looking for another external standard to obey. It's not about measuring with a different ruler. It's about breaking the ruler, about deciding that your worth doesn't depend on a stopwatch or the number of things you can endure before falling. Imagine waking up tomorrow and deciding to act as if you didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Not a little, not halfway, nothing. Imagine the lightness you would feel. Imagine how much energy would be freed to create, to explore, to enjoy if you didn't have to invest every minute maintaining the facade that you can handle everything. Because here's the most unusual part of this story. All that you pursue so avidly, admiration, trust, magnetism, only appears when you dare to stop pretending. When you give yourself permission to be okay without turning your life into an endless marathon. If after everything you've heard today, you still feel the temptation to think you're the exception, that you really do need to push yourself to the limit, I want you to remember this. The human mind will always prefer known slavery over freedom it doesn't know how to control. That's why you'll return to your old pattern if you don't consciously decide to break it every day. Don't expect a video to change your existence, but allow it to be the first crack in the wall you've been reinforcing for decades. Now, before you close this screen and get lost again in routine, I want to invite you to one last act of rebellion. If you've truly felt something stirring inside, if you recognize that your way of pushing yourself has robbed you more than it's given you, write in the comments the phrase, "I don't need sacrifice to be valuable." Because that phrase isn't just a set of words, it's a commitment, a reminder, the seed of the life you can still build. This conversation will keep ringing in your head every time you feel the temptation to sacrifice yourself for applause that never lasts. The next time you're about to say yes when your heart screams no. The next time you think you have to prove your worth by exhausting yourself. You'll hear my voice reminding you that freedom begins when you decide your existence is already enough without embellishments or penances. Remember this. The minds that transform the world are not the ones who wear themselves out the most, but those who dare to think differently. The peace you seek isn't found at the end of endless effort. It's found at the very moment you decide to stop running from yourself. If you enjoyed this video, support the channel. Like, share, and subscribe.